Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm Shawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching.
We are close to the end of June, which is mid-year. So today we're going to talk about a mid-year review and how we can use powerful coaching questions to just reflect and look at the first 6 months of the year, looking for clarity. We're not looking for, judgment or anything like that. We're just looking at clarifying our goals, solidifying the ones that are working, and calibrating as well. And it's a really great way to look back and reflect on how far we've come and what we've accomplished in the first 6 months of the year. And there are questions that we can ask that come straight from coaching that can help clarify and realign us with our goals, our values, and the things that we really want in life. So today, that's what we're going to be focusing on. Eryn, have you ever done like a mid-year review? And in the coaching space, let's just look at it from the coaching space. Like, what are some practices that you use with clients or, personally that help you review and reflect and look at things and also realign and recalibrate?
Yeah, I am not at the individual level a person that does a traditional mid-year review. I tend to be reflective kind of consistently from a day-to-day approach. But from like a bigger systems thinking approach, I think it would make a lot of sense to reflect and create something a little bit more structured for a mid-year review. So now that this is being brought into our conversation, I do want to try to do something a little bit more formal with myself. And then with my clients, it just depends. I would say when I was doing more of like the academic coaching type of work, there was a lot more consistent mid-year type of review, very structured in that way. In the grief coaching space, it doesn't flow that way in a lot of ways. But the powerful questioning and the reflection consistently flows throughout the grief coaching approach. I could see where for some clients, I could implement it a little bit more robustly, the mid-year review. And then for others, it just doesn't make sense for where they're at or their style or their needs. But I even think just taking a day in the middle of the year after the summer solstice, right, to say, how am I doing? And just checking in at the most general level can be really helpful. And then, like we're talking about today, using powerful questions as a way to better understand ourselves, the situation, and those around us to be able to show up as our best selves. And so that's kind of where I start this conversation from in my mind. But LaShawn, what about you with the mid-year review? What's that like for you, both at the personal and professional level?
Likewise, I don't really have a system in place where I'm doing like formal mid-year reviews. I know some people have journals, that are specifically designed to do that, to do mid-year reviews and also to do year-end reviews. I actually don't really have a system in place personally for that. And then as far as coaching space and working with clients, actually, that's just part, the reflection piece. I'll take that. The reflection piece is part of just the coaching model that I use. There's a point at which when you're working with a client, you start with a goal, you start with a topic or something that you want to really focus on. And as is often the case, as you're moving along in the process, you go deeper and perhaps wider, and you notice, hey, even though I started with this question or this thing that's coming up for me, I'm realizing that there's more here. And then that's where, as a coach, I check in and say, hey, remember where you were at the beginning? Where are you now? And where would you like to go? So that's kind of like a mini review, basically, within the coaching model. And as far as like working with clients, we wouldn't have like a mid-year review, because oftentimes I'm working with clients on a 3-month or 6-month basis, rarely 12 months, but we absolutely halfway through will do a review. We'll go, okay, so this was your goal when we started. Where are you now? How are you feeling? Let's look at how far you've come. And where would you like to go? What would you like to let go of in order to make room for more of what you're wanting? So that's kind of what we do as just like positive intelligence coaches. We do that anyway with our clients. But as far as like a formal mid-year or year-end review. I haven't really done that with a client. However, I do like the idea of reflection, and I do like the idea more as I'm getting older and as, I really am thinking about where I want to be and what I want to do with my life and how I want to make an impact in the world. And just realizing that there seems to be more years behind me than ahead of me. And so I do start to kind of think about maybe I need to be more intentional. I do sort of feel like I'm reactionary, like I'm putting out fires. And then in the process of putting out fires, it's like, where's the like intentionality and where's the big picture? So sometimes I do feel a little bit myopic in my life, like I'm just looking at the one thing or I'm just reacting to things rather than having a plan and being more intentional about what I want to do. So having a mid-year review is exciting for me because it's a way to slow down and it's a way to really take stock of how far I've come or how far we've come, like in our podcast, and then also looking at the next 6 months. How do I want to be more intentional? That kind of thing. So those are the things that are coming up for me when I'm thinking about a mid-year review. So Eryn, is there anything that's coming up for you that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I like what you're saying about being intentional and not being so myopic. And that is something I struggle with a lot, not necessarily as a coach. I think as a coach, when I'm coaching other people, that I can feel into and go through the process of all the layers with the client in a way that's meaningful to them and for them to do their own meaning making. And I think that's my strength in coaching. But I like this idea of the intention of being able to look back and see where you've come, what are some of the challenges and what are the intentions for moving forward, and that question of what do you need to let go of, like you said. I think that these broader scale questions are really helpful to start adding some framing to, well, what does that actually mean? And what does that look like? And at what capacity do you have? And how would you implement these things? Like that's why coaching is so necessary and so helpful, because it can help you then get to those layers. I'll use that word again, to take those powerful questions and create meaning and create clear steps and clarity to move forward in a way that is highly beneficial to the client. Because I can think of 2 clients right now, how they would be moving forward looks different for each person. And, and I think that tends to be the case. And I think that I sometimes struggle in the mid-year kind of process and thinking about it and getting hung up on looking back and not enough of the intention of looking to the future at a personal level. Again, in coaching, it's almost the opposite. It's like I do much better as a coach than I do with myself, right? And maybe that's why we have therapists and coaches as coaches, right? We need that support too. And so just thinking about the word intention today is really standing out to me as you brought it up. And I'm wondering to kind of form some questions around that, like, what is my intention each day or in the work that I do? And I think at the macro level, I am very clear on that. And that is something that I try to embody and pursue. At the micro level, my emotional kind of state can get the best of me, and I can not see the bigger picture or not be as intentional in the day-to-day moments. And so I'm starting to kind of self-coach myself right now through that process. Well, what would a more intentional life look like? What would that look like in the next 10 minutes? What would that look like for me throughout the rest of the day? And again, it's not that easy. And that's why coaching is so powerful, because then it becomes, well, how do you do that the rest of the day? And what are some tools you can use when your thoughts start to get the best of you or things like that? And so I think that there is a level of nuance with intention that maybe could be looked at a little bit more from the coaching lens in my own personal life. So for those who are listening out there, just know that we struggle too with this as individuals. And I love this word of intention mirroring the mid-year review and what that might look like for you. And it kind of takes it down a level too, because maybe it's all about intention at the most small level within the next day and then moving forward from there. It doesn't have to be these lofty goals for the next year. I mean, it could be, right? For some people, that might be helpful depending on the individual, but it can be something that fits your wants and needs, that fits your daily cadence. I didn't sleep well last night. So what I implement today is going to have to be probably scaled down and implemented a little bit differently too. So all those factors when we think about our day-to-day life experiment. And I think just holding that space to say it's messy and it's hard. And that part of it all, it's okay if you're not matching your intention all the time. It's okay if you're not quite getting there all the time, right? It's part of that process of just being reflective and then asking yourself those powerful questions to reflect on what's going well for you and what could shift or what could change or how are you impacting others too? Because we always talk about, right, intention and impact going together. And what do those two things mean? I might have pure intention about something, but the impact might be harmful or hurtful. And so not only thinking about our own intention, but how that impacts those around us too, and what that means for the health of, the humans in your life and sort of thing. So I think that's where I'm at with that. And I like that you brought in that word.
When we're intentional, I think it gives us some direction and purpose. And I think that's also a really important part of feeling, and just to speak personally, like just feeling satisfied with the trajectory of my life or where I'm going. So that if I'm intentional, then I know that it's easy to say no to things and it's easy to say yes to things, because if you have an intention, then you have a direction. So if your intention is to be more mindful, you could say something like, is this, is scrolling on my phone, is that a mindful activity or not? So you could say, no, let's do something more mindful, like go for a walk or pay attention to my breathing or something like that, so that you can in the moment. And I like that you boiled it down to, in the next 10 minutes, how can I be more intentional, or what am I doing to be intentional? I think it's really important when we are looking at, reviewing, reflecting, that we're looking at not just the big picture, but just the day-to-day, the present moment, and how one can feel more connected and grounded and purposeful when just in like 10 minutes or in the day. So I think that's really important as well. And I like that you bring in the piece of impact and intention, and how we might intend something, but if we're not aware of, or we don't acknowledge the impact of the action that we take in that intention, then we could lose sight of how it's affecting other people in our lives. And I think that's also really important too. And I think one can be intentional about that as well. One can be intentional about being aware of the impact one has on others in their lives, and how that can shape our relationships, that can shape the way things turn out. And of course, we don't want to be, but we don't put the cart before the horse. We don't want to think, oh, I need to do things that are going to be pleasant for other people just because. But we do want to be aware of, how we're interacting with others, how we're showing up, and how that's affecting the people we care about and the people in our lives. I think that's important and that brings in interdependence as well, something that we've talked about several times in this podcast, that interdependence, and what does that look like? And I do believe that being aware of intention and impact is important. If we look at a year in, or a midyear review, there's like a structure. And if we think about like the reflecting, and that's one of the things that we touched on, but and I think about some questions that we can ask, some powerful coaching questions that we can ask. One thing that comes to mind is, when looking back, when we're reflecting on the first 6 months of the year, we could ask ourselves, what felt aligned, or what actions did I take, or what experiences that I had in the first 6 months felt most aligned. That can give us some information about where we are on track with the things that fulfill us and help us feel like we are living in purpose and that we are on the right track, so to speak, for ourselves, of course. And it really has to come from within. And so when we really think about what felt aligned, and so what does it mean to feel aligned? And one of the things that I think about when I think about what it means to feel aligned is there's a certain resonance with things. Like, for example, one thing that felt aligned for me, just personally, in the first 6 months that I've done, is just being able to be present and show up and learn. That's really felt aligned to me. just being in a position where I am present, where my ears are open, my heart is open, and I'm listening and learning. So being in the space of a learner has felt aligned for me. And therefore, I would like to continue that, to be in that space of learning and expanding my knowledge, learning from others, and also just observing the situation and taking time to really understand what's happening. How about you, Eryn? What's felt aligned for you? Or what are some other powerful questions that you would ask at that stage where you're reflecting at the first 6 months?
Yeah, I mean, just on the other end of that question is, what didn't feel aligned?
Right.
And that can give information too, in a different way. But also looking back, and maybe can somebody consider what was one of the most joyful days they had in the past 6 months? Why? What did that look like? Who were you around? Going back to that interdependence piece, not, and why was that also uplifting? I mean, I'm still kind of stuck on this learner, because you talked about the learning being aligned for you. And for me personally too, that is very much a space that I enjoy being in and feel comfortable in, but also am still learning and growing. And so it makes me curious about that growth zone model again, questions around that, looking back, where were you uncomfortable and why? And what, like looking ahead to, what environments or what would you try to expand that growth zone for yourself? And then also recognizing, as you were experiencing that joyful day, going back to that question, what were you feeling inside? What were you thinking? And that goes back to that alignment as well too. I think those alignment pieces. And it just depends on the type of coaching too, because grief questions, there might be a little bit different, or like career could look a little bit different. But I think one of the best tools I was ever given early on in my coach training was to focus questions mostly on learning and being questions, and then the other ones on the actual action questions or doing questions. So we kind of are in that realm of learning and being as we look back to over these past 6 months to kind of come up with some of these powerful questions. If you could have changed one day, what would you have changed about it and why? Or even like doing some more of those wishful thinking exercises, especially if things weren't in alignment. If you won the lottery today, what would your life look like over the past 6 months? And then build off questions from that, because I think at the core of that gets to values, that gets to personal wants and needs and desires. And I think that's where you can really then hone in on some powerful questions for the individual in particular. I'm trying to think of then for me on my own level of my personal level, what would be a good question for me to look back over the past 6 months. And I think it has something to do with what would it be like to be okay with messy relationships, or, like kind of something around that. That would have been that's a helpful reflection question for me looking back over the past 6 months. And then also I'm thinking back over the past 6 months, that's winter here in Colorado. It's very dark. That tends to be more where people will present with seasonal depression here. And that's not always the case, but also taking those things into consideration when asking those questions, I think can be really powerful. And then when I had my car accident, not this past year, but the year before, that winter, I was doing physical therapy consistently and putting most of my energy into healing. And there's something powerful in being able to do that. Not that that's what I would have chosen, but when I think about my mood, looking back 2 years and then looking back this past year, I think it was in a better place. And so I have to ask myself, maybe I was more rested. And maybe so just being curious, and maybe not just about the past 6 months, but looking at that in comparison year over year can also be helpful too. So coaching is amazing because we get to be curious and explore all these questions with our clients. And I think, and especially at a very individualized level, and that's really powerful, where I can't really think or understand of many spaces where you get that one-on-one support in that way, where it's tailored to these curious questions that have no motive, like they're very much just in this curious space, trying to help them increase their self-understanding, increase their self-worth, increase their confidence in themselves and meaning making for themselves too. So every time we talk about coaching, like more directly, I just get more excited about what coaching can do and can do for me personally too. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And just I think the process of talking to a coach about our values, answering those curious questions that coaches pose in a session can be really enlightening, and it's just the process itself is great because you're recalibrating, you're discovering things about yourself that you may have taken for granted. When someone else is observing with an open and curious mind, the questions that are asked in that are very different. It's one of the things I love about the coaching process is the revelations that happen in the space of a 60-minute coaching session. It's pretty amazing when you're co-creating with someone who doesn't have an agenda. They're just being curious. And the things that open up when we're curious reveal so many strengths and great things that might be taken for granted when you're just going through the day to day. You're going through the day to day grind. It's easy to lose sight of the small and fulfilling things in our lives that we just kind of take for granted because those things are pleasant, but we're not really focusing on them because our brain is wired to look for anomaly and look for things that are not working. So all the things that are working are just kind of taken for granted. So when you're taking that curious stance and you're going through that coaching process, whether it's a mid-year or year-end or anything kind of view or values, there's so much that can be revealed, and we then can reconnect to some of our most cherished traits or experiences when we are interacting with a thought partner who's curious. Really makes a difference. This I think is kind of veering towards the idea of reclarifying or refocusing. Eryn, you were talking about how not last year, but was it 2 years ago that you had the accident, where you were reflecting on and almost refocusing on that time when you seemed to be in a better mood because you were spending so much time healing. And looking at the things that you were doing and the circumstances around that resulted in that kind of change, that a higher mood, and then taking that lessons or that reflection and applying it to, hey, how can I recreate that, and finding ways that you can then refocus on creating space for healing or creating space for rest, because I know rest is a really big part of healing. So that's one way that we can reclarify or refocus what we really want and what we want to happen. So one of the things, and Eryn, you shared this with me this morning, is the question about what you need to release to make space for the things that you really want. So that's one thing that's another powerful question that we can ask in coaching, where we are focusing on what can be released, and in order to make room for what is wanted or more of what is wanted. So that's one question that I was thinking about in terms of refocusing, reclarifying. Eryn, can you think of anything?
Yeah, I mean, I just even nuancing the word clarity, maybe, what would bring you clarity here? Or what do you need to have more clarity? Those are two kind of slightly different questions. And I think too, also using that reflective piece to understand that clarity, like you were just nuancing and talking about, looking back, what brought you that clarity during that time. But even, in this assessment piece, how do you even define clarity? And is it something that you need to have in all areas of your life? Where is it lacking in parts of your life? Where is it fine in parts of your life? And everybody is going to have parts where it's probably okay and parts where it could probably use a little bit more support. And so I think just like when I think of that coaching playfulness is just playing around with the word and wordsmithing it. And, I love that. And I love words and writing. So that might be a fun approach for me. We'll see for what other clients, think about that approach too. But, and actually I will say in the grief space, it is a little bit, I feel like, more challenging to get to that playful piece now that I'm talking about this aloud, due to the nature of what we're talking about potentially. I'm now curious about, should I be bringing in a little bit more of that playfulness at certain points into the coaching process with my clients I'm working with through the grief process? But other reflections that kind of bring more sustenance, for lack of a better word, maybe it's a question about a menu. What do you need on the menu? What do you want to take off? My therapist is a big on the statement of, you can't get milk at the hardware store. So that's her way of saying, you can't get from that individual what you're expecting. That's just not going to be an option. And so I like that statement, and I know there are other ways to say that same thing. And so I think that's also a good reflection at kind of the mid-year time frame. And then also just thinking about how the climate, what's the seasonal piece for you here too, I think is really important. And for a lot of jobs, there is a seasonal cadence that's very clear. For a lot of other jobs, there are not. My job is not that way. I thought it would be, but it's kind of up. I can't predict the seasons of it very well. And then, my husband, working in a school district, has a very kind of clear cadence to what that looks like for him. So there are those factors too, I think, that can make a big difference in this reflection at the mid-year. Do you have a question that someone's asked you that really helped you gain clarity, or that made you maybe consider something a little bit differently or consider it in a different way?
The kinds of questions that bring clarity for me is questions regarding how I want things to be. That tends to give me more clarity personally, because I think I spend a lot of time either focusing on what I don't want or what's going wrong, or what I did wrong, or whatever the case may be, that I very rarely focus on what has gone right or what I do want. And I think one question that often brings clarity for me is kind of along the lines of what I do want, but actually along the lines of what I need, or where I feel it in my body. Often if I'm asked to focus on my body and what my body is saying, or how it's feeling in my body, it guides me to be still and to just focus in, hone in on what's going on the physical level. And then it allows me to then focus on what the emotions around that. Then there's some clarity in that, because then I'm able to reduce the noise around it and then really hone in on what it is that I'm seeking. And often it's more of a sense of my own confidence, feeling a certain way about how something is going, and just being confident in my choices, and also giving myself grace. That's also a part of it too. And there's a lot of wisdom, I think, in our bodies, and in kind of listening to my body, it helps to, the only thing is I can think is clarify, the source of whatever it is that's discordant. And then I can really focus on that. Oh, at that moment I felt this way, and breathing into it helps as well. So I think a lot of like somatic, like if people are asking you, like, where do you feel that in your body? Where is that? Is there tension there? Where are you feeling that in your body? And also, what do you really want? And so those are some questions that do lead to clarity for me. Yeah.
Listening to that was peaceful. On my side, I was just like, closing my eyes and doing some of this, somatic scanning of my body too. But I love that you brought that piece in, because that piece is so important, and so much wisdom in that, and in the breath. And then acceptance, like, what do you need to accept the situation as it is. And, maybe you can't change anything about the situation, but the acceptance can be in the way that you move forward in your own life. Something you embody, or something that you take forward, or something that you learn, right? Again, you go on and take a class or something, and that leads to an even greater acceptance. There's a lot of wisdom and spirituality around this too. And this is where I struggle a lot. Like, you hear that in spirituality, and you hear in some church traditions or other religions potentially, but you also hear like that grace piece that you talked about. And I think that is invaluable. It's so invaluable. And I don't even remember being introduced to like this concept of giving myself grace until adulthood. Like, it wasn't something I don't think we talked about, especially in college, right? Like, that's almost the opposite of, and I know it's changed, times have changed for sure, but I think that there's something really powerful in that word grace. And then that can lead to that acceptance that I tend to struggle a little bit more with. And then I was thinking of another word, and I just lost it, but related to that spirituality piece of, it's not this word, but this word is also important and very empowering, and also really can lead to some really powerful questions around forgiveness. What do you need to forgive in your life to move forward at this point? Or what are some forgiveness practices you could take? Oh, yes, that was the last one, gratitude, the gratitude piece. And I know I've had some kind of complaints in a way about like having forced gratitude practices, but I think that they can be a really helpful tool in a lot of different ways. And the whole point being is that, like, as much as we think we're in control, are we, right? When we think about acceptance, and we think about forgiveness, and we think about gratitude, and then and grace. I mean, these terms show up in my life and tend to be a little bit more in the spiritual realm, but I think they all can lead to very powerful questions, and could also be internalized, to move forward, looking to the last half of the year in a way that feels abundant, feels of abundance. And I think I'm sitting here with these words, and there's stuff coming up for me inside that I don't quite know yet when I think of forgiveness and acceptance and grace and gratitude. So maybe that's something to explore later too. But I think it's leading me in a way to like this. Okay, so where do we go in the last half of the year? What does that look like for people in their planning? So, yeah.
No, absolutely. I think that really naturally segues into what's next. And I loved how you hone in on those. It was it three? Let's see.
Four this time.
Four. It was four this time. So it was grace, forgiveness, gratitude,
acceptance.
Right. So those are four really powerful words. And one thing that comes to mind, as I've seen in, some research and midyear reviews, is like having a midyear word, like, is your word going to be grace? Is your word going to be acceptance? But why not take all four? Abundance.
Right?
There you go.
I know. Put it on my desk here.
And then just like have that word that you could, as an anchor, that's going to help hold you to the things that you want for the remainder of the year, for the 6 months remaining, or, whatever. It's going to give you that direction. It's going to be your North Star for the remainder of the year, where you're giving yourself grace, and you're really exploring what that looks like, what that feels like when you give yourself grace, when you forgive yourself, when you forgive others, when you accept what is and what can't be changed, or which is out of your control. And so I think those things are great ways to give you some direction or some idea of like where you want to be. And it gives you that anchor that's going to bring you back to what you really want, or what you want for the remainder of the 6 months. I think that's definitely something to consider when you are looking forward and giving yourself that little nugget. So kind of going into the part of the episode of coaching nugget of wisdom, that little nugget that you can have that you can go back to. So yeah, since we are getting very close to the end of the episode and we're getting to the coaching nugget of wisdom, one coaching nugget of wisdom that I have that's come to mind is we've had lots of questions in this episode, and it's an invitation for the listeners to go back and pick one of those questions and maybe apply it to your next 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or next 24 hours, something like that. So choose one question that really resonates with you. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a question. It could be a phrase or a word like grace, forgiveness, acceptance. See how you can integrate that into your next 10 minutes or 24 hours. Eryn, what do you have?
I really like that, LaShawn. There's something powerful about having conversations with coaches, in a very obvious way in terms of what we talk about on our podcast and what we believe in. But I think there's also something really powerful in having conversation with a friend and, approaching that from a place of that curiosity and asking powerful questions. So maybe try that with a close friend when you're in the right space to do so, and ask each other some powerful questions. At the very least, I think that improves the relationship and you get to know each other a little bit more. But it could also lead to, more coaching nuggets of wisdom or changes in your life that you want to manifest.
Thanks for joining us for Coaching as Benevolence. I'm LaShawn with Mayshell Sage Place, Positive Intelligence Coaching.
And I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings, Grief and Loss Coaching.
Have a benevolent day.